I have my little scripts to the side, I write it all in like a normal 12-point font, but my eyesight is so terrible that when I'm filming I have to make it like 30 points. Anyway, hi and welcome to my channel Explain. My name is EK, and this past weekend I went to see a film called The Lost King, and in this video I want to talk to you about it. It's not really a review so much as like my thoughts. I watched this film for two reasons. One, a lot of it was filmed in Edinburgh, where I have just moved from. And two, because I felt that based on the trailer, the intensity of Richard III's scholars was being captured accurately. Generally, I study late medieval to early modern England and Scotland, anything from around the 11th century to kind of the early years of the 17th century. I studied various aspects of the Wars of the Roses and the Tudors during my undergrad, and my master's thesis, which I wrote over the summer, was on Margaret Tudor, the sister of Henry VIII. So I have like a decent grip on the context in which Richard III lived and died, as well as how his memory was kind of received and transmitted by his Tudor replacements. So, to summarise, the Wars of the Roses in essence was caused by Edward III having too many fucking kids.
Yep, that's me. You're probably wondering how I ended up in this situation.
I got one minor detail wrong in this section, so I'm refilming it so that I don't live with the knowledge that I made this minor mistake in years to come. The War of the Roses, in essence, was caused by Edward III having too many fucking kids. Their descendants all had claims to the throne of England by virtue of their descent from Edward. After Edward died, his grandson became Richard II, but he was deposed by a cousin called Henry Bolingbroke. Henry Bolingbroke was the son of Edward's son, John of Gaunt, the Duke of Lancaster. Henry ruled as Henry IV, his son as Henry V, and his son as Henry VI. Henry VI had periods of ill health, so the nearest male heir, Richard the Duke of York, stepped in, which spilled into the civil conflict that we know as the Wars of the Roses. Richard died in battle against Henry VI's forces, but his son Edward took up the cause and won, ruling as Edward IV. Edward IV married a woman named Elizabeth Woodville, and they had an entire flock of children. Edward had two brothers, George and Richard. By the time of Edward's death in 1483, George had already been executed for treason. Edward IV's young son was thus named as Edward V. What happened next is subject to intense disputes, but the end result is much the same. Edward V and his brother were taken to the Tower of London by their uncle, Richard, and eventually disappeared. Richard became king as Richard III. In 1485, Richard was killed at the Battle of Bosworth against Henry Tudor, who then ruled as Henry VII. Henry Tudor was a Lancastrian, descended from John of Gaunt through Gaunt's third wife, Catherine Swynford. The end. Except it's not the end. As I alluded to, this entire episode is littered with controversy, and it is this controversy that the film seeks to address. On the whole, it was a really enjoyable film. The passion of historians was captured beautifully, the excitement was there of a history mystery, which we all love. You know, there's a reason that them Dan Brown books did so well, and it wasn't the quality of the writing. We all want a solved mystery, and finding a dead monarch underneath a car park seems almost too good to be true. The story goes thus. Philippa Langley, an amateur historian, spearheads an effort to find the mortal remains of Richard III, the last Plantagenet King of England. Various locations had already been suggested, and there were different theories to what might have happened to his body after his death, but Philippa focuses her research on a car park in Leicester, under which she hopes to find an old churchyard. She comes up against various naysayers, and is aided throughout by a spectral apparition of Richard himself, who begins visiting her after she attends a performance of Shakespeare's Richard III. Ultimately, Philippa is victorious, the remains are found, analysed, and the University of Leicester sweeps in to take all the credit. Sally Hawkins is great as the kind of uber-dedicated, slightly off-balance Ricardian Philippa Langley, and while I have never understood the appeal of Steve Coogan, I enjoyed his performance, and of course Mark Addy was excellent as expected. The film employs kind of a David and Goliath framing, with Philippa kind of fighting Shakespeare and the establishment. This is not a framing that other involved parties have supported. The University of Leicester's Richard Taylor, who's played by Lee Ingleby, and Richard Buckley, who is played by Mark Addy, have strenuously objected to their portrayals. And to an extent, I sympathise. I think it might have been wiser to maybe have created like vaguer composite characters or fictional representatives of these kind of institutional forces rather than casting real people in ways that might now leave you open to legal issues. But on the other hand, I feel it was pretty obvious that the story had been massively oversimplified, both in terms of the actual narrative events and individual characters. I also think that some of the elements of the plot and the kind of character dynamics resonated even if that wasn't necessarily how it happened. Philippa's story kind of picks up on real battles that do take place in today's historiography and represents this tussle over figures like Richard III. For me, however, the most poignant conflict was Philippa versus ableism. There are some elements in the kind of wider Ricardian discourse that seem to imply that the worst thing a person can be is disabled.
I just realised, like, I kind of don't explain this in the video. I think I was being a bit arrogant and assuming that everybody knew, but one of the key kind of things about Richard's portrayal in Shakespeare's Richard III, and therefore like after that, was that Richard III had some kind of disability. And in Shakespeare's play, he's like, oh, I'm so ugly, blah, blah, blah. And he has kind of like, like most of the time when he's portrayed by actors who do not have a disability, he's kind of got like a withered arm. So before Richard's remains were found, there was the debate about whether or not he had some kind of disability that was being like mocked in Shakespeare's Richard III. And when the remains of Richard III were found, his spine was curved, and I think it is now kind of been assessed that he probably had scoliosis. So he did have some kind of a disability. Which I do, like, I talk about these things in the video, but if you haven't like read anything about Richard III, or you haven't like read anything about the play, then you may not be aware of that. But yeah, okay, peace.
Shakespeare's grotesque portrayal of Richard III as disabled is undoubtedly fueled by ableism. The trope of a disabled villain lives with us today, not least in almost every James Bond film. And until the discovery of Richard's remains, there were sometimes hints that saying he was disabled amounted to declaring him guilty of treason, regicide, and all the other crimes laid at his feet, when in fact Richard could well have been both innocent and disabled. So I was quite hesitant going into the film until about 5 minutes in, where Philippa mentions having ME. ME stands for myalgic encephalomyelitis, and the reason I know that and the reason I've bothered to learn to pronounce it is because I have myalgic encephalomyelitis. It is a chronic condition with unknown causes, and its most prominent symptom is bone-deep, insatiable, withering fatigue. So Philippa has ME, she kind of struggles to be taken seriously by her boss because of it, but that experience informs throughout her approach to Richard III. She knows that disability and chronic health conditions do not produce villainy. She actually says after watching the performance of Shakespeare's Richard III that she refuses to believe that being disabled simply makes someone do terrible things. So that resonated with me personally. I don't study kind of specifically disability history, but of course you're going to come across it very, very often. I'm actually planning to do a video discussing kind of disability history in a few weeks, so keep an eye out for that one. But returning to Philippa, her ability to kind of use her experiences and emotions is, I don't want to call it like inspiring, but I think it's an important element in the film, which underpins Philippa's kind of second battle, which is against the Academy. Philippa's conclusions and her instincts are dismissed as emotional, as feelings that should be disregarded in favour of a mysterious, non-existent thing called objectivity. Objectivity doesn't exist. It is impossible not to bring your own preconceptions to your study of anything, including history. Anyone who tells you otherwise is either lying to you or themselves. Once you accept that your own feelings and experiences cannot be erased by you or anyone else, you can learn to use them. Your response to a person, an event, or era is unique, and it might be something groundbreaking. It might not. I'm not saying that your delight at visiting Hampton Court Palace will sustain a PhD thesis necessarily, But I am saying that your emotional connection to history can be useful. For example, in my postgraduate study, I mostly wrote about women, particularly the relationship between women and power, because I felt like on some level I could relate to how these women who were navigating patriarchal power structures might have felt. Philippa's experiences with chronic health kind of run parallel to Richard throughout the film, with other people's opinions of her health being kind of compared to perceptions of Richard's health. She kind of offers like deeper, more nuanced, or just different insight into how Richard might have felt about his own body. It does help, admittedly, that Philippa's conclusions, which I have no doubt were supported by extensive research, ended up being right. She stuck to her guns, she pushed to make things happen, and she won the prize. They found Richard in that car park. The discovery was literally groundbreaking, and the analysis, both kind of historical and archaeological, that it produced is momentous. Not to mention the general interest that was sparked in Richard, although Richard has never kind of languished in the recesses of English history, and that is in part thanks to Philippa's final and greatest adversary. When I was at secondary school here in the UK, we had to study at least 2 Shakespearean plays. For my GCSEs, when I was like 15, 16, we wrote about Macbeth, but my exams in year 9, when I would have been 14, I think, you just study one scene from a Shakespearean play, and we studied Act 1, Scene 2 from Richard III. This scene includes Richard taunting Anne Neville as they stand by the corpse of Anne's late father-in-law. Well, of course he's late, they're stood by his corpse. This scene includes Richard taunting Anne Neville as the pair stand by the corpse of Anne's father-in-law, Henry VI. Anne married Henry VI's son, Edward of Westminster, in 1470, but Edward died in 1471. In this scene, Richard is kind of lusting over Anne, and the pair do eventually marry. In order to study this play, we watched the 1995 adaptation of Richard III, which stars the unparalleled Ian McKellen as the titular character. It has a whole bunch of like slightly random famous people in it as well. Like Maggie Smith is in it as Cecily Neville, who was Richard's mother, which is kind of like, yeah, Shakespearean vibe, I get it. And then Kristen Scott Thomas, I think, plays Anne Neville. But Robert Downey Jr. is Elizabeth Woodville's brother, Anthony Rivers, which is just, I don't remember him being in it at all, but I mean, I'm not sure when it came out, like in terms of Robert Downey Jr.'s career, but he's like on the front cover of the DVD or VHS, whatever it was then. Anyway, in this adaptation, the setting has been transferred from medieval England to 1930s Britain, with the Plantagenet monarchy ruling over a fascist state. How is any of this relevant to my review? It's not at all. But if you want to see an adaptation that is kind of following the Shakespearean version of events, that is the adaptation that I recommend you watch. And it is that version which Philippa, like many other Ricardians, rail against so fervently. To an extent, I can see why. Shakespeare is ruthless, as is his Richard. His portrayal of Richard is not flat, it's very dynamic, thanks in part to the many soliloquies and kind of conversations that Richard has with the audience. But his Richard is unforgivable. He is a medieval Emperor Nero. He is as evil as he is disabled. And I understand why so many Ricardians fight so vigorously to prevent Shakespeare having the last word. But I think some caution is needed. It is one thing to recognise the impact of Tudor propaganda on Richard III's legacy. It is quite another to refute its tenets. Just because a narrative is biased, in this case the maligning of Richard III, to support the establishment by conquest of the Tudor monarchy in 1485, this does not make the opposite necessarily true. Yes, the Tudors had a vested interest in defaming Richard III, arguably more so than they did Edward IV, because Henry VII had married Edward IV's eldest daughter, Elizabeth of York. They characterise, obviously, Richard as cruel, tyrannical and murderous, but this does not mean that Richard should be considered kind, fair and reasonable by default. I mentioned this in my video last week about royal sisters when I was discussing the biographies of saints. These biographies, why I said that really weirdly, these biographies, if I'm an ography, I'm a biog. Anyway, these biographies, say it again! These biographies are obviously and extremely favourable towards their subjects, but that does not mean that their fawning is automatically inaccurate. There is a grain of truth in everything much of the time, and the goal should be to unpick it, not discount it. I don't think Philippa has fallen into this trap, and I do plan to read her book that she co-wrote about finding the remains of Richard III, but I think the film does. It casts it as kind of a zero-sum game where either Shakespeare was right and Richard was awful, or Shakespeare was wrong and Richard is an unfairly besmirched victim of Tudor propaganda that went uncritiqued for centuries. By extension, I think the film focuses on some slightly arbitrary metrics against which to measure Richard's morality, such as his status as a usurper, as well as the legitimacy or otherwise of Edward IV's sons with Elizabeth Woodville. I don't think the issue of whether or not Richard was a usurper is that relevant. Whether his nephews were or were not illegitimate is kind of immaterial to me. And yes, I did just look that word up. The reality was, Richard said that they were illegitimate and on that basis took the throne for himself. I don't know if it matters what the truth was in these elements of Richard's story, even if we could discover, you know, what actually happened to the princes in the Tower, or whether Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was kind of null and void. Richard claimed that Edward IV had already been married by the time he married Elizabeth Woodville, which would mean that his sons and all his children with Elizabeth Woodville would have been illegitimate. But whether Richard deserves the label usurper doesn't change the fact that he was the de facto king of England for 2 years. It kind of risks a prescriptivist assessment, looking at whether he should have done X or Y rather than just accepting that he did, and instead looking at kind of like the whys and the hows and the result of it actually was. Just because someone should have done something doesn't mean they did, and just because someone shouldn't doesn't mean they didn't. I think we risk getting... This is kind of a strange analogy, but bear with me. It reminded me of when it was kind of the early years, kind of the first 2 years of Donald Trump's presidency, and kind of journalists and writers would say like, oh, you know, Trump wants to do this, but he can't, you know, that's against the law, he'd need congressional blah, 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 all that kind of shit. And then he'd just do it anyway, and everyone kind of was like, oh.
Sorry to interrupt myself doing a stellar job of explaining my point of view. But the thing that has just kind of dawned on me while I was editing is a lot of the debate centres on whether Richard was wrong or right to do what he did. So whether he was right to take the throne because his brother's sons were illegitimate, or was he wrong to do this? And it's like, it doesn't matter whether he was right. There is a conflation of him being right to do what he did as him being good and him to be wrong, being evil, etc. And it's like, it doesn't matter if he was wrong or right, it matters that he did it, and we can look at the impact of that as well as kind of the causes of it. Like, I remember reading an article in like the BBC History magazine that was essentially going to great lengths to explain why Richard must have felt he needed to do what he did. And it was very much framing it as Richard's fear that his nephews would be too far under the influence of their mother's family, so Elizabeth Woodville and kind of the wider Woodville family. And I just don't know if that matters. I think Richard is of scholarly value anyway, and I think there's lots of debates and discussions that can happen. I just don't know if him being right or wrong, whether he was a usurper or whether he was like legitimately the king, that's just not as prescient to me.
If nothing else, the film is very enjoyable. Edinburgh looks beautiful, although I don't think anyone has ever seen the castle that quiet. Surely they could have like had extras. I don't know why they had to film in the the empty castle. Harry Lloyd playing this kind of spectral apparition of Richard III was an excellent plot device, although I kind of wish that we'd seen a little bit more of Philippa's like fellow members in the Richard III Society, and a bit less of Steve Coogan. Like he was good in it, but I thought like, oh, you know, we saw a lot of him and he wasn't really that pertinent to the plot, and then I found out that he wrote it, and okay, that makes more sense. So from a personal enjoyment perspective, I gave it 4 stars. From like a boring historical perspective, I would maybe knock it down to 3. Well, can I have halves? I mean, I can, because I'm the one deciding this metric. So yeah, 3.5. I'm giving it 3.5. Have you seen this film? Are you going to see it? Either way, I would love to hear your thoughts about it in the comments. Thank you very much for watching, and until next time.